A young man builds a fortune in just 2 years, outpacing his aunt's lifelong savings. Jealousy poisons her heart, twisting admiration into obsession. While he trusts her blindly, her own son sees the change, the restless eyes, the probing questions, the secret notebook of stolen details. Quietly, he becomes his cousin's unseen protector, setting traps and blocking her every move. When she finally tries to take what isn't hers, he catches her red-handed. In the aftermath, she breaks down, confessing envy and regret for dreams she never chased. The family survives, but innocence shatters, and silence becomes his greatest weapon. Let's diving in the deep to know. The news of his sudden wealth didn't come like a whisper. It roared through the family like a storm, loud and impossible to ignore. 2 years had been enough for the nephew to build what others had chased for decades. The house he bought gleamed new, the car outside hummed with quiet power, and his bank account carried a weight that pressed on everyone who learned of it. For him, it wasn't bragging. He moved through life with ease, almost careless in how he spoke of the numbers he'd reached, believing family was safety and trust was eternal. But envy is patient. It doesn't show its face immediately. It hides in polite smiles, nods of congratulations, and embraces that linger a second too long. His aunt wore all of those masks perfectly. She smiled at him, praised his success, and reminded him that he was making the family proud. Yet beneath those layers, something twisted and grew darker every day. She compared his bank balance to her lifelong savings. The math didn't lie, and it stung. What he had stacked up in 24 months outshone what she had managed across decades. To her, it wasn't just money. It was proof that life had cheated her, that she had wasted her prime years walking the long road while he found a shortcut. Resentment didn't arrive in one piece. It dripped slowly, moment by moment, until it filled her completely. At night, she replayed his casual words in her head, imagining his tone as smug, even if it wasn't. She studied his gestures, convinced that he flaunted his wealth when he was only being himself. The bitterness hardened. Soon, her mind wasn't just comparing, it was calculating. The nephew noticed none of it. He believed in her completely. She had been a second mother during his childhood, always the one who slipped him extra food when his plate was empty. The one who spoke soft encouragement when the world seemed harsh. Trust ran so deep that suspicion never touched him. If anyone else accused her of bad intentions, he would have laughed it off as nonsense. But her son knew better. He didn't hear her thoughts, but he saw the changes in her habits. She lingered too long near the nephew's laptop when he visited. She asked oddly specific questions about where he kept important documents, about how much time he spent away from home, about his digital accounts. At first, the son dismissed it as harmless curiosity, but curiosity kept repeating, sharpening, turning into obsession. The son remembered her eyes when she opened the old ledger where she kept her savings records. She stared at the faded numbers, then whispered about wasted years. She didn't notice he was watching, but he caught the tremor in her hands, the bitterness pressed tight into her lips. That night, he couldn't sleep. The nephew remained blind to all of this. He moved freely, almost proud to show his aunt the life he was building. He left receipts on the table, forgot his account notifications were visible on his phone, and sometimes even shared details of his investments with her, thinking she might feel inspired. She nodded, praised, and asked for more. Each detail was ammunition for her imagination, fuel for the storm growing in her chest. Greed has a way of rewriting loyalty. She began to justify it in her mind. She told herself she deserved some of what he had. Hadn't she helped raise him? Hadn't she supported the family when times were tough? Hadn't she sacrificed dreams so others could chase theirs? Yes, she thought, she had earned the right to take a share, maybe even more than a share. What was family, if not a place to redistribute luck? Her son watched this mental shift unfold like watching a bridge crack under invisible pressure. It terrified him because he knew where it led, and yet he couldn't bring himself to confront her directly. She wasn't just his mother. She was the woman who had held him through sickness, who had fought the world alone to raise him. How could he accuse her of planning to betray her own blood? The thought made his stomach twist, but denial wouldn't protect his cousin. So he chose silence. Silence, but not inaction. The storm brewed quietly. On the surface, the family looked united, full of laughter and shared meals. Underneath, suspicion and greed clashed with loyalty and protection. It was a game invisible to the nephew, who kept walking through his days with ease, unaware of the eyes following him, unaware of the traps his cousin would soon build, not to harm, but to shield him from the person he trusted most. Her envy sharpened with each passing week. What began as restless thoughts at night now consumed her mornings, afternoons, and evenings. The numbers were played in her head like a broken record. 2 years against her entire lifetime, his fortune stacked against her fragile savings. Each time she measured the difference, she felt the ground beneath her shift. Resentment calcified into obsession. She became restless in her own home. Her hands fidgeted when she sat too long. Her eyes darted toward anything that reminded her of him. When she cooked, she caught herself pausing in the middle of chopping vegetables, lost in calculations of how much one of his checks could buy. When she lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, imagining the accounts he kept, the passwords he must have, the mistakes he might make if she watched closely enough. The son noticed her changes more clearly than before. She spoke less to him and more to herself, muttering fragments of ideas that made little sense at first. She started asking questions framed as jokes. Where do you think he hides his passwords? Don't you think he leaves too many receipts lying around? Wouldn't it be careless if he trusted the wrong person? Her tone tried to pass as casual, but the hunger in her eyes betrayed her. The nephew remained blissfully unaware. He continued to treat her with affection, giving her updates about his work and showing her purchases as if they were a point of pride for the family. She encouraged him, but every time she praised him, her smile tightened, her jaw stiffened, and her son could see the cost of her performance. Soon, the lines between fantasy and action blurred for her. She began testing boundaries. She asked her nephew to borrow his laptop to check her email, lingering longer than necessary on his open tabs. She offered to help him organize his financial paperwork, feigning concern that he might misplace something important. She pressed him to share more details about his schedule, framing it as interest in his busy life. Each question she asked was a thread, and together they formed a net. The son's unease grew into dread. He no longer doubted her intentions. He saw the path she was taking. Her fixation wasn't temporary. It was turning into a plan. He caught her standing in the living room one evening, staring at his cousin's backpack as if it were a treasure chest. When she noticed his eyes on her, she forced a laugh, brushing it off as daydreaming. But the son knew what he saw. She didn't realize he had begun shadowing her in quiet ways. He noticed how often she checked the locks when her nephew visited, how carefully she observed his phone whenever it lit up with notifications. He saw the notebook she started keeping in her drawer, filled with scribbled reminders, dates of his visits, hints of where he left things, even sketches of numbers she thought she caught glimpses of. She believed she was subtle, but her secrecy leaked into the air like smoke, and he could smell it everywhere. Her obsession infected the household atmosphere. Meals became tense, though the nephew didn't notice. He laughed, he ate, he shared, while mother and son carried the weight of invisible war. The son felt trapped between two impossible loyalties: his cousin, who trusted too easily, and his mother, who betrayed that trust with every silent calculation. The son struggled with anger. He wanted to confront her, to shake her out of the spiral, to remind her of the love she had once shown freely. But each time he opened his mouth, the words stuck. What if she denied it? What if she turned her fury on him? What if he destroyed the fragile bond holding them together? Silence felt safer, even though it burned inside him. But he could not remain passive. If she took one step too far, the damage would be irreversible. So he chose a different path. He began to protect his cousin quietly, without revealing his mother's intentions. He started watching more closely, moving objects when he sensed her attention on them, making subtle changes that would foil her curiosity. When his cousin left receipts on the table, the son gathered them before his mother could. When his cousin's phone buzzed unattended, the son made sure to place it back into his cousin's hand instead of leaving it out. When his mother pressed for details about his cousin's accounts, he intervened, changing the subject or fabricating distractions. Each small act of interference widened the secret war between him and his mother. She noticed her opportunities slipping, though she couldn't see how. She grew sharper, more frustrated, muttering about bad timing, about missed chances. He said nothing, but each time her frustration deepened, his resolve hardened. The tension built like a storm without release. The nephew sensed none of it. He saw only his family together, believing the warmth was genuine. He moved with careless trust, never realizing the shadows circling him. The son felt the weight of isolation. He couldn't tell his cousin. It would shatter his trust in the family. He couldn't confront his mother. It would break her image as the caretaker she once was. So he lived between them, a silent guardian balancing on a thin line, each day waiting for the moment when his protection might no longer be enough. His mother's obsession no longer needed fuel. It had become self-sustaining. She stopped asking for updates and instead began searching for them herself. She moved through the house quietly after visits, peering into the nephew's belongings when she thought no one watched. She studied his patterns, convinced she would find the crack in his armor. But her son always watched. He tracked her movements, memorized her habits, anticipated her next steps. He had turned himself into a shadow of her shadow, a presence she didn't realize was blocking her every move. The storm edged closer to breaking. One misstep could expose everything. And deep inside, the son knew the moment was coming, the moment when his silence would no longer hold the family together. The son understood that waiting wasn't enough. If he simply blocked her every chance, she would keep searching until one day she succeeded. Prevention needed to become protection, and protection required strategy. He began building small defenses in secret. Nothing obvious. His cousin could not suspect, and his mother could not feel cornered. He created layers around his cousin's life, walls invisible to both of them. The first was digital. He encouraged his cousin to upgrade his online accounts with stronger security, disguising it as advice about general safety. He offered to help set up alerts for unusual activity, claiming he had read about hackers stealing personal information. His cousin shrugged, agreeing without thought, never realizing the true danger wasn't strangers, but someone sitting across the family table. The second layer was physical. The son noticed his cousin often left his backpack lying around. He started casually moving it closer to his cousin before his mother's eyes could linger on it. When his cousin left the room, the son slipped in after him, ensuring no personal items remained exposed. He acted like it was coincidence, but every move was intentional. His mother grew restless. Each time she reached for an opportunity, it disappeared. She convinced herself that bad luck haunted her. When she thought she spotted a password scribbled on paper, it vanished the next day. When she planned to peek into his bag, the bag was already zipped and out of reach. She whispered curses under her breath, never realizing her own son had turned into the obstacle. The son, meanwhile, crafted quiet traps to confirm his suspicions. He left false breadcrumbs for her to follow, details that seemed valuable but led nowhere. He placed old receipts in obvious spots, watching to see if they disappeared. He wrote meaningless numbers on scraps of paper and tucked them inside his cousin's belongings, pretending to forget them. Each time, his mother's curiosity betrayed her. The receipts vanished. The scraps of numbers moved from one place to another. She thought she was clever, but to him, each theft was proof. His heart ached as he collected the evidence. Every missing scrap was a betrayal, not of his cousin who still trusted her blindly, but of the mother who had raised him. It cut deeper than he expected. Protecting his cousin felt right, but exposing his mother felt unbearable. He lived in a constant paradox, both angry at her and desperate to save her from herself. The pressure only grew heavier. His cousin's success continued to expand, and with every new purchase, every new achievement, his mother's obsession deepened. She no longer pretended to be casual. She demanded updates from her nephew, masked as pride but dripping with hunger. She pressed for details about his business, about his future plans, about how he managed to rise so quickly. The son saw her desperation, turning reckless. The careful observations gave way to riskier behaviors. She hovered too long near his phone. She walked into his room while he showered, pretending she had something to drop off, her eyes darting everywhere but her hands empty. She offered to help organize his papers again, pressing harder this time, insisting he needed her support. The son intervened each time, sometimes subtly, sometimes forcefully. He started staying in the same room whenever his cousin visited, refusing to give his mother a chance to be alone with him. He distracted her with sudden questions when her eyes grew too sharp. He intercepted her offers to handle his cousin's belongings, claiming he could do it instead. The invisible war reached its peak when he planted a final test. He left a small envelope on the kitchen counter, marked with his cousin's initials. Inside, there was nothing valuable, just blank paper folded neatly. He left it there deliberately, waiting. His cousin knew nothing about it, and his mother wasn't supposed to know either. But when he checked the counter the next morning, the envelope was gone. He found it hidden in her drawer, half opened, as if she had been interrupted before finishing her search. The sight left him hollow. She hadn't hesitated. Curiosity had turned into action, and action had crossed the line into betrayal. The son sat in silence that night, staring at the ceiling the way she once had. He thought about exposing her, ending the charade, warning his cousin. But the words never came. He feared destroying both relationships at once, losing his cousin's trust and his mother's love. He carried the burden alone, swallowing the weight of two loyalties tearing him apart. Meanwhile, his mother continued to spiral. The obsession consumed her so fully that she barely noticed her son's distance. She thought of nothing but her nephew's fortune, each thought a spark that lit the fire higher. She believed she was clever, believed her steps were unnoticed. She didn't see the shadow behind her every move, the silent guardian pulling strings to keep her from success. But shadows can only protect for so long. Each defense carried risk, each trap pushed her closer to realization. And deep down, the son knew the truth: she would not stop. The storm had built too high, too loud, too fierce. Eventually, she would strike openly, and when she did, he would no longer be able to remain silent. The breaking point came quietly at first, disguised as an ordinary evening. The nephew arrived with his usual brightness, bringing food and laughter, talking about his latest project. He left his backpack by the door, his jacket over a chair, his phone charging on the counter. To him, the house felt safe, wrapped in family. He trusted the walls, trusted the faces inside them. But his aunt's mind no longer worked like his. Every detail looked like opportunity. The backpack wasn't just a bag, it was a vault. The phone wasn't a device, it was a key. The jacket pocket wasn't fabric, it was a hiding place. She saw everything through the lens of hunger. Her son felt the tension immediately. He had grown attuned to her moods, able to sense the shift in her posture, the quickness of her eyes. Tonight she was sharper, her gaze restless, her movements tighter. She waited for the right moment, the sliver of time when her nephew's guard would drop. The moment came when he stepped outside to take a call. The backpack sat unguarded. The phone buzzed faintly on the counter. The air felt charged. His aunt moved swiftly, her steps light, her hands practiced. She reached for the backpack, her fingers curling around the zipper. But her son had been waiting too. He had planted his own trap earlier, a final safeguard for the inevitable. Inside the backpack, beneath the ordinary items, he had slipped another envelope. Unlike the first, this one carried weight. False documents crafted to look real enough to tempt her, meaningless enough to prove her guilt. She pulled the zipper down, her breath shallow, her eyes hungry. She rifled through notebooks and papers until her fingers landed on the envelope. She froze for a moment, her chest rising quickly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the initials written on it. Desire overpowered hesitation. She slipped the envelope out, unfolding it with shaking hands. Her son watched from the doorway, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had dreaded and prepared for. He stepped forward silently, watching her face as she scanned the papers. Confusion crossed her expression first, then frustration, then fear, as she realized the trap. She looked up and found him standing there, his eyes fixed on her, the evidence clutched in her hand. The silence between them roared. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Excuses crowded her throat, but died before they formed. Her son's gaze stripped her of every mask, every justification. She saw the disappointment etched in his face, the quiet betrayal of a child who had watched his mother unravel. The nephew's voice echoed from outside, casual, unaware. He finished his call, steps moving closer to the door. Panic spread through her like fire. She stuffed the papers back into the envelope, fumbling with the zipper, her movements frantic. Her son stepped forward, steady, his hand stopping hers. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, time froze. Everything unspoken between them flooded the space, her greed, his protection, the silent war that had raged unnoticed. The weight of years pressed down, memories of love tangled with the sharp edges of betrayal. The door opened. The nephew stepped in, smiling, oblivious. He glanced at them briefly before reaching for his phone, thanking them for waiting. He didn't notice the envelope half hidden, the tension vibrating in the air, the way his cousin's hand held his aunt's wrist. The son moved quickly, covering the moment with practiced ease. He pulled the envelope away, sliding it into his pocket. His voice calm as he redirected his cousin's attention toward the food waiting on the table. The nephew smiled again, distracted, moving into the kitchen. But the damage had been done. His aunt stood frozen, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with something more than fear. Shame, regret, anger all colliding inside her. She turned toward her son, her lips trembling as if to beg for silence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had already unfolded. The rest of the evening moved like a blur. The nephew remained cheerful, unaware of the storm swirling inches away. He ate, laughed, and eventually gathered his things, thanking them as always. His aunt hugged him tightly, almost desperately, her grip lingering longer than usual. He left without suspicion, waving as he disappeared into the night. The house fell into stillness. The son and his mother stood in the silence he had been holding back for months. The weight of the envelope pressed in his pocket, the weight of her betrayal pressed between them. She finally crumpled, her body folding into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Her breath came ragged, and for the first time her son saw her not as the schemer, not as the threat, but as a broken woman consumed by envy she couldn't control. The silent guardian had won the battle, but victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like loss. The silence after the nephew's departure weighed heavier than his presence ever had. The house seemed hollow, stripped of the easy warmth his laughter once filled it with. The aunt remained seated, her body bent forward, her face hidden in her hands. Her son stood across from her, motionless, as though any word or movement might shatter what little remained of her pride. Her breathing came uneven, shallow at first, then louder, as if the air itself hurt to take in. She didn't speak, but the sound of her sobs filled the room, raw and unrestrained. They weren't the quiet tears of someone ashamed of weakness, they were the jagged cries of someone who had reached the end of her illusions. Her son didn't rush to comfort her. He couldn't. The wounds ran too deep, the betrayal too sharp. For months he had carried the burden silently, watching her fall into obsession, protecting his cousin from her schemes, hoping somewhere inside she would stop herself. But she hadn't. She had stepped past the line, and in doing so she had broken more than trust. She had broken the foundation of who she once was. At last her voice cracked through the silence. Not words, not yet, but sounds of pain spilling into the air. She pressed her palms harder against her face, rocking slightly, as though motion could erase what had just happened. When the words finally came, they emerged fractured, pieced together with breathless effort. She spoke of wasted years. She confessed the bitterness of watching her nephew's rapid rise while she counted every cent of her slow savings. She described nights spent awake, replaying the math of her life, realizing how small her efforts looked compared to his fortune. Each number had cut her like a blade. Each comparison had hollowed her further. She admitted she had justified it to herself. She told herself she deserved some of what he had, that the years she sacrificed for family entitled her to a share of his success. She had convinced herself she wasn't stealing. It was reclaiming what life had stolen from her. But now, sitting there with her son's eyes fixed on her, the words sounded empty, pathetic even to her own ears. Her son listened in silence, every confession stabbing deeper into his chest. He wanted to scream, to ask her why she hadn't trusted him enough to speak of her pain before it twisted into greed. He wanted to remind her of the woman she used to be, the one who had lifted others without expecting repayment. But he said nothing. The silence was harsher than anger, and she felt its weight pressing down harder than any accusation. The sobbing slowed, though the tears didn't stop. Her voice steadied just enough to turn softer, almost pleading. She spoke of regret, not just for being caught, but for losing herself, for letting envy drown her until she didn't recognize her own reflection. She admitted she had felt the shift for months, but she hadn't fought it, because for once in her life, she wanted more. The son's chest tightened at those words. He saw her pain, raw and unguarded, and though anger still burned, compassion tugged at him. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman who had grown tired of sacrifice, a woman who had buried her dreams so deeply that someone else's success felt like theft. He sat down across from her, not close enough to touch, but near enough to show he hadn't abandoned her completely. The distance between them was heavy, but it was connection nonetheless. She lifted her face, eyes red and swollen, searching his expression for condemnation or mercy. What she found was neither, only the steady gaze of a son who still loved her, but could no longer see her the same way. The night dragged on in that fragile balance. She spoke, he listened. Silence filled the gaps. No resolution tied it neatly together. No apology could erase what had happened. But in the hollow space of that night, something shifted. The obsession lost its grip on her. The hunger drained away, leaving exhaustion in its place. Days passed before the household felt normal again. The nephew continued visiting, unaware of the storm he had barely escaped. His trust remained intact, untouched by the shadows that had nearly consumed it. He spoke freely, shared openly, his innocence unbroken. The son carried the secret alone. He never told his cousin what had happened. To expose it would destroy too much: his cousin's trust in family, his mother's dignity, the fragile bond that still tethered them together. Silence became his shield once more, not to protect from harm this time, but to preserve what little peace remained. His mother changed, though subtly. The sharpness in her eyes softened, the restless movements quieted. She no longer asked invasive questions or lingered too long over her nephew's belongings. Instead, she seemed smaller, humbled, as though the fire had burned itself out. She spoke less about money, more about ordinary things: gardens, meals, weather. But beneath the surface, the son could still see the scars of envy, the weight of regret she would carry forever. He had saved his cousin. He had stopped his mother. But the victory left him altered too. He no longer looked at her with the same unshaken trust. Love remained, but it was complicated now, layered with sorrow and disappointment. He became older in those months, hardened in ways he couldn't reverse. The silent guardian had fulfilled his role, but guardianship always came with a cost. He had protected his cousin from betrayal, but in doing so, he had witnessed the slow collapse of the woman he once saw as unbreakable. In the end, the family survived intact on the surface. The nephew thrived, the aunt carried her regrets quietly, and the son stood between them, forever changed. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered like thunder in the distance, a reminder of how close they had all come to losing everything. And though no one else knew it, the son understood the truth. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought in silence, and sometimes the deepest wounds are carried not by the betrayed, but by the guardian who held the line unseen. Thanks for listening. Hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe.